The firelight caught the edges of tusks first, then eyes that reflected amber and wary, and Brennan Quade decided in that instant not to reach for his rifle. She had already seen him. That much was clear from the way she stood half behind an oak at the clearing's edge, one hand resting on a knife hilt but not drawing. The valley stretched dark and dense behind her, full of the sounds that had kept both of them awake for weeks now. The restless shuffle of something large moving through underbrush, the distant bleat of frightened sheep, the crack of branches that spoke of weight and purpose. He kept his hands visible, turned the rabbit he was roasting, and said nothing. The smoke carried the smell of charred meat and rosemary into the summer night, and after a long moment she stepped forward into the light. Green skin, darker across the bridge of her nose where the sun had touched it. Leather armor worn soft at the joints, a short bow across her back, and mud caked to her knees in a pattern he recognized. She had been down by the eastern creek, the one that cut deep between slate banks, and she had crouched in the same spot he had found 2 days ago where something with claws had torn apart a ewe and left the wool scattered like snow. "You are tracking it too," she said. Not a question. Brennan nodded toward the log opposite his own. "Sit if you want. Rabbit is almost done." She studied him for another breath, then moved with the easy grace of someone who spent more time in wilderness than in houses. When she sat, she kept the fire between them, which was smart. "He would have done the same. I saw your marks," she continued. "You measure the stride, you collect the scat, you are methodical. Methodical keeps you alive." He pulled the rabbit off the spit, set it on a flat stone to rest. "Your tracks circle wider. You are looking for a pattern, not just the animal." The corner of her mouth twitched, not quite a smile, but something like respect. "It is killing in a pattern. 3 farms along the North Ridge, then 2 near the miller's house, then back north again. It is not random." "No," Brennan agreed. "It is not." He cut the rabbit in half with his belt knife, offered her the larger portion on a cleaned piece of bark. She took it after a pause, and they ate in silence while the fire popped and settled. Overhead the stars were sharp and cold despite the summer warmth, and somewhere in the distance something howled. Not a wolf. He had heard enough wolves to know the difference, and this sound had a frustrated edge to it, like a hound baying at a closed door. "My name is Lira Greenbrook," she said when the meat was gone, and she was wiping her fingers on her thighs. "I am a scout for the White Peak clan. We have summer grazing rights on the western slope, and 3 weeks ago something killed my brother's best horse. Tore out its throat while it was hobbled. He was sleeping 10 feet away and heard nothing until it was over." Brennan Quade. He fed another branch into the fire, watched the flames climb. "I am under contract to Lord Ashford. He owns most of the valley, and his shepherds have lost 24 head since the spring thaw. He thinks it is wolves, but wolves do not kill like this." "Wolves kill to eat," Lira said. "This thing kills and leaves the meat. That is rage or sport, or training." She looked at him sharply. "You think it is a dog. I think it is something that was a dog once." Brennan stretched his legs toward the fire, let the warmth soak into his boots. "The tracks are too large for a wolf, and the stride is wrong. Wolves hunt in packs, coordinate, bring down prey efficiently. This is solitary, brutal, wasteful. It is the way a hound kills when it has been encouraged to be vicious and then left to entertain itself." Lira was quiet for a long moment, turning that over. "Your lord keeps hounds. He keeps a lot of things." Brennan kept his voice neutral. "I have only been in his employment for 2 months, but I know he has a kennel near the manor house. Big brutes, half wild. I heard them when I went to collect my advance." "And you think he set them loose?" "I think someone did." He met her eyes across the fire. "But I took his coin, and I gave my word I would find what was killing his stock. So I will find it, and then I will decide what to do about it." She studied him with an intensity that would have made a lesser man look away. Finally, she said, "You are not what I expected." "What did you expect?" "Most human hunters in these valleys shoot first when they see an orc." She said it matter-of-factly, without bitterness, as though it were simply a truth about the weather. "Especially out here alone at night. You did not even reach for your gun." Brennan shrugged. "You were not sneaking. If you wanted me dead, you would have put an arrow in me before I ever saw you. Anyone with eyes could see that. Not everyone has eyes." But she smiled when she said it, just a little, and the tension in her shoulders eased a fraction. They talked through the night in fragments, building a picture of the thing they both hunted. Lira had been tracking it for 2 weeks, ever since her brother had nearly been mauled trying to drive it off from the horse. She had followed it south through the pine forest, across the high meadows, down into the valley's oak and beech woods where the farms clustered along the creeks. She had lost the trail 3 days ago when the eastern creek flooded after a storm, cutting her off from the rest of her clan. "The crossing is still too high," she said, frustration creeping into her tone. "I have been waiting for it to drop, but the rain keeps coming. I sent word with a trader heading west, but I do not know if it reached them." "You could go around," Brennan suggested, "up to the North Ford. That is 2 days out of the way, and the trail would be cold by the time I returned." She shook her head. "I will wait. The water will drop, or you could work with me." She went still. "Why would you want that?" "Because you know this animal's habits, and I know the valley." He leaned forward, elbows on his knees. "Because you are tracking for justice and I am tracking for coin, and between us we might actually find the truth. And because—" he paused, choosing his words carefully. "Because I am beginning to think the truth is going to be a problem for powerful people, and I would rather not face that alone." Lira regarded him for a long time, her dark eyes reflecting the firelight. Finally, she said, "If we do this, we share everything. Information kills credit. I will not be your assistant or your charity case. I would not insult you by suggesting it. And if your lord does not like an orc involved," Brennan smiled, and it was not a kind expression, "then my lord and I will have a conversation about what he is paying me for." She surprised him by laughing, a low, rough sound that warmed something in his chest. "All right, Brennan Quade, we have a partnership." They shook on it, her hand warm and calloused against his, and by the time the sky began to pale in the east, neither of them had suggested she should leave. When he unpacked his bedroll, she fetched her own from where she had cached it at the clearing's edge, and they slept in shifts through the dawn, one always listening to the woods while the other rested. The days that followed fell into a rhythm that felt older than either of them, something primal and right. They moved through the valley like 2 parts of a single organism, reading the land and each other with an ease that should have taken months to develop. Lira taught him to spot the subtle things. The way grass bent differently under a paw versus a hoof, the difference between old scat and new, the particular sound of claws on slate versus claws on limestone. Brennan showed her the valley's hidden architecture, which farms paid tithes to Ashford and which held independent charters, where the old property boundaries ran, which shepherds were honest, and which would lie to cover their own negligence. They found more kills. A goat disemboweled behind a tanner's shop, its guts spread in a mockery of violence. 2 sheep taken from a pen in broad daylight while the farmer was at market, their bodies dragged into the woods and partially eaten. A calf, barely a week old, with its throat torn open and its mother standing over it, wild-eyed with grief. At each site Lira took measurements and samples, collecting tufts of coarse hair, scraping dried saliva from wounds, examining the bite patterns with a clinical precision that impressed him. Brennan talked to the farmers, took notes on timing and weather, sketched maps of the attack locations. At night they compared findings, and the picture that emerged was damning. "Look at the pattern," Lira said one evening, spreading Brennan's map between them. They were camped in a birch grove above the valley's midpoint, where they could see the lights of Ashford's manor winking in the distance. Every attack happens within a day's walk of the manor house. The furthest north is 6 miles, the furthest south is 7. It is a circle. "A territory," Brennan said slowly. "The way a dog marks a territory, and it always returns to center." She traced a line with one green finger. "See, 3 attacks north, then back south near the manor, 2 attacks west, then back east. It is hunting outward and coming home." Brennan stared at the map, feeling something cold settle in his stomach. It is being kept there, fed there, or kenneled there. They looked at each other across the map, and Brennan saw his own grim certainty reflected in her face. It was one thing to suspect, another to have proof sketched in ink and charcoal. Lord Ashford was either negligent in the extreme, or he was deliberately letting his hounds run wild and blaming the wolves so he could justify a cull. Either way, people and animals were suffering for it. "We need to see the kennels," Lira said. "That means going onto his land uninvited. You work for him. You are invited." "I work for him as a hunter, not a spy." Brennan rubbed his jaw, thinking, "But you are right. We need proof, something more than a map and a theory. If we are going to accuse a lord of negligence or worse, we need to be certain." They planned it for 2 days hence, when Ashford would be away at a regional court session in the county seat. Brennan would go openly, on the pretext of reporting his progress and checking his gear. Lira would come from the woods, staying out of sight, and they would meet at the kennels after dark. The intervening days were strange, charged with something Brennan did not want to name. They worked well together, had from the first night, but now there was an intimacy to the partnership that went beyond tracking and tactics. He found himself watching the way Lira moved through the forest, the unconscious grace of her stride, the way she tilted her head when she was listening to something only she could hear. He noticed how her tusks were small and neat, barely protruding past her lower lip, and how she had a habit of running her tongue over them when she was thinking hard. He noticed the scars on her hands, the way her ears swiveled toward sound, the fact that she sang under her breath sometimes when she thought he could not hear. And she noticed him noticing, because of course she did. She was a scout, trained to read signs, and he was apparently as subtle as a bull in a market square. "You are staring again," she said one evening, not looking up from the snare she was setting. Brennan felt heat crawl up his neck. "Sorry. I did not say stop." She glanced at him then, and her eyes were bright with something that might have been amusement or might have been challenge. "I am trying to decide if it bothers me. Does it? No." She turned back to the snare, adjusting the trigger. "That is what I am trying to decide about." They left it there, unspoken and complicated, because neither of them knew what to do with it. Brennan had never been attracted to an orc woman before, had barely interacted with orcs at all beyond brief encounters in market towns. He knew the prejudices, had grown up hearing them, but they felt distant and absurd next to the reality of Lira. Competent, sharp-witted, brave, and so beautiful it made his chest ache when he let himself think about it. And he was beginning to suspect she felt something similar, though she hid it better. She stood closer than she needed to when they were examining tracks. Her hand lingered on his shoulder when she steadied herself on a steep slope. She smiled at his jokes, even the bad ones, and sometimes she watched him with an expression he could not quite read, something soft and searching. But they had work to do and a lord to confront, and so they kept their focus narrow and their hands to themselves. The night they broke into the kennels was moonless and hot, the air thick with the threat of another storm. Brennan approached openly from the east road, nodding to the gate guard and spinning a story about needing to check his spare rifle, which he had left in the manor's armory. The guard waved him through without interest, and Brennan made his way across the grounds toward the kennels, which squatted in a stone building behind the stable block. The smell hit him first. Shit and piss and old meat, thick enough to make his eyes water. The hounds were barking inside, a cacophony of rage and frustration, and through the narrow windows he could see shapes moving in the darkness. Big shapes, far larger than any herding dog or even a mastiff. Lira materialized out of the shadows near the stable, silent as smoke. "The door is barred from outside," she whispered, "but the hinges are old. We can lift it." Together they worked the heavy door up and off its pins, setting it aside with exaggerated care. The hounds went berserk, hurling themselves at the interior gate, and Brennan held up a lantern to see what they had found. There were 6 of them, maybe 7, hard to tell in the chaos. Each one was massive, easily 150 pounds, with wedge-shaped heads and scars crisscrossing their shoulders and flanks. They had the look of boarhounds bred to something larger and meaner, and they stared at Brennan and Lira with eyes that held no recognition, no domestication, only hunger and hate. "They have been starved," Lira said quietly. "Look at their ribs." She was right. Beneath the muscle and the fury, the hounds were gaunt, their hip bones jutting, their bellies hollow. Someone was feeding them just enough to keep them vicious and desperate, then letting them out to hunt. "Proof," Brennan muttered. He moved deeper into the kennel, careful to stay clear of the gate, and found what he was looking for in a corner. A pile of wool, bloody and matted, alongside several gnawed bones that were definitely not beef or pork. Sheep bones. Fresh ones. Lira was examining the feeding troughs. "Look at this." She held up a scrap of paper, water-stained and torn. "It is a bill of sale, 5 stone of mutton scraps delivered weekly, signed by the manor's steward. They are feeding them stolen meat to keep them hungry," Brennan said slowly, "and then blaming the wolves when they kill. Why would anyone do that? Because wolves are easy to hate and easy to cull, and once they are gone, Ashford can charge the farmers for protection." Brennan felt a cold clarity settling over him, the pieces clicking into place. He has been planning this for months, maybe years. Build up the fear, eliminate the predators, become the only option for safety. Lira's expression was murderous. "And let his dogs kill livestock, kill my brother's horse to make it happen." "We need to take this to the bounty court," Brennan said. "They meet in 3 days down in the valley seat." "If we present the evidence, he will deny it," Lira interrupted. "He will say we planted the wool, forged the bill, that we are lying to protect the wolves. Then we need more." They found it in the steward's office, a small room attached to the stable where the manor's accounts were kept. It took Brennan less than a minute to pick the lock, a skill he did not explain and Lira did not ask about. Inside, they found ledgers going back 5 years, and 3 entries that damned Ashford beyond any defense. The first was a payment to a trapper named Collies for problem animals, disposed of quietly. The second was a notation about kennel expansion and new breeding stock from the northern barons. The third was a letter, never sent, in which Ashford outlined his plan to a fellow lord. Create a crisis, eliminate the natural predators, establish a private guard force that farmers would pay handsomely to maintain. Lira copied the letter in her precise, angular script while Brennan photographed the ledger pages with a daguerreotype camera he had brought for documenting kills. It was delicate work, and illegal as hell, but by the time they heard footsteps approaching they had everything they needed. They slipped out through a back window, replaced the kennel door, and vanished into the woods before the night watch made his rounds. By dawn they were miles away, camped in a cave above the eastern creek with their evidence wrapped in oilcloth, and their hearts pounding with equal parts fear and triumph. "He will come after us," Lira said. She was sitting with her back to the cave wall, her bow across her knees, watching the lightening sky. "When he realizes what we have taken." "He will try," Brennan agreed, "but we are not without resources. You are one hunter, and I am a scout cut off from her clan." "You are a scout whose clan has grazing rights in this valley, and I am a hunter with friends among the independent farmers." Brennan turned to face her. "We are not alone, Lira, and we are not wrong. That counts for something." She looked at him then, really looked, and something shifted in her expression. "You are risking everything for this. Your contract, your reputation, maybe your life. Why? Because it is right." He said it simply, without embellishment, because it was the truth and he had never been good at lying. "Because those farmers deserve to know what is killing their animals, and the wolves deserve not to be slaughtered for something they did not do, and your brother deserves justice for his horse. And because—" he stopped, swallowed. "Because you deserve a partner who keeps his word." Lira set her bow aside carefully, rose, and crossed the small space between them. She was tall enough that their eyes were nearly level, and when she reached up to touch his face, he felt the calluses on her palm like a benediction. "I have known you for less than a month," she said quietly. "That is not enough time to feel what I am feeling." "No," Brennan agreed, "it is not. And yet—" She kissed him then, and it was like coming home to a place he had never been. Her mouth was warm and sure, her tusks smooth against his lip, and when she pulled back they were both breathing hard. "We should wait," she said, "until this is over, until we are safe." "We should," Brennan agreed. Neither of them moved. They made love in the cave while the sun rose over the valley, slow and careful and full of laughter when they fumbled. Afterward they lay tangled together in Brennan's bedroll, her head on his chest and his hand tracing idle patterns on her shoulder, and he thought that if Ashford did come for them it would have been worth it just for this. But Ashford did not come. Not that day or the next. They made their way down to the valley seat, a small town built around a mill and a market square, and found the bounty court in session beneath an open-sided pavilion. There were perhaps 50 people gathered, farmers and herders, a few merchants, the magistrate and his clerk, and a handful of off-duty soldiers lounging in the shade. Brennan and Lira presented their evidence methodically, laying out the maps and the photographs and the copied letter. There was silence when they finished, then an uproar. Half the crowd was shouting about orc lies and forged documents. The other half was shouting about murdered sheep and stolen coin. The magistrate banged his gavel until the noise subsided, then called for Lord Ashford to respond to the charges. Ashford arrived within the hour, riding hard from his manor with a contingent of guards. He was a tall man, well-dressed and well-spoken, with the kind of easy authority that came from generations of wealth and power. He listened to the accusations with an expression of wounded dignity, then offered his rebuttal. "These are lies," he said simply, "concocted by a hunter who broke his contract and an orc with a grudge. I keep hounds, yes, as is my right and duty. They are well fed and well controlled, used for hunting boar and deer, nothing more. If they have escaped, it is through accident, not design. As for this letter," he gestured dismissively at the copied document, "anyone could have written it. I certainly did not." It was a good defense, and it might have worked if Brennan had not been prepared. He reached into his pack and pulled out a second piece of paper, the original bill of sale for mutton scraps which he had taken from the kennel. It bore Ashford's seal, clear and undeniable. "This is your seal, is it not?" Brennan held it up for the crowd to see. "And this is your steward's signature. Are you claiming someone forged those as well?" Ashford's face went very still. "Where did you get that?" "From your kennel," Lira said. "The one you have been using to house starved hounds that you released to terrorize the valley. The one where you feed them stolen mutton to keep them vicious." There was another uproar, louder this time. Several farmers were on their feet, shouting about their losses, demanding restitution. The magistrate called for order, then for witnesses. Over the next 2 hours, a parade of people came forward. The steward, who confessed under threat of perjury that he had been following Ashford's orders. A farmer who had seen the hounds running loose on his land. A trapper who testified that Ashford had paid him to kill wolves and leave their bodies where they would be found, to bolster the story of a wolf problem. By the time the sun reached its zenith, the case was closed. Ashford was fined heavily, ordered to pay damages to every farm that had lost stock, and stripped of his hunting rights for 5 years. The hounds were to be destroyed, except for 2 that the trapper testified were young enough to be retrained. And the wolves, those that remained, were to be left alone, protected by a new law that the magistrate drafted on the spot. Lira's clan received restitution for the horse, along with an apology that Ashford delivered through clenched teeth. And Brennan received his pay, though he immediately handed half of it back to cover the cost of establishing 2 warden positions to patrol the valley and prevent future abuses. "We will need good people for those positions," the magistrate said. "People who know the land and can be trusted. Do you have any suggestions?" Brennan glanced at Lira. She was standing beside him, her hand resting lightly on his arm, and she was grinning. "I might," Brennan said. The rest of the summer passed in a blur of work and learning. Brennan and Lira took the warden posts, splitting the valley between them but working together more often than not. They built a cabin on the high summer pasture, where the western slope met the valley floor, a place with clean water and good sight lines and room for a garden. Lira's clan approved the match after a formal meeting where Brennan answered questions about his intentions and his ability to provide. And several of her brothers tested his skill with a bow and found him adequate if not exceptional. The valley's farmers were slower to accept an orc in a position of authority, but Lira won them over through competence and consistency. She tracked down a pack of feral dogs that had been harassing the southern farms, negotiated a truce between 2 neighbors feuding over water rights, and taught a dozen children how to set snares and read weather signs. By autumn, even the most skeptical had to admit she was the best thing that had happened to the valley in years. Brennan found himself settling into a life he had not known he wanted. He had spent years drifting from contract to contract, never staying long enough to build roots, never trusting anyone enough to risk partnership. But with Lira it was easy, natural. She challenged him, made him laugh, called him out when he was being foolish, and stood beside him when things got hard. And she loved him, openly and without reservation, in a way that still took his breath away. They were married on the first day of summer, a year and a day after they had met at the fire. Lira's clan came down from the high peaks, and the valley's farmers came up from their fields, and they gathered at the cabin to witness the ceremony. It was a blending of traditions, orc and human, formal and intimate, full of music and food and laughter that echoed across the pasture. Brennan stood beside Lira beneath an arch woven from wildflowers and oak branches, and when the officiant asked if he took her as his wife, he said yes without hesitation. She said yes in return, her voice strong and clear, and when they kissed, the crowd erupted in cheers. That night they lay together in their cabin, the windows open to the summer breeze, and Brennan traced the line of her jaw with his fingertips. "I never thought I would have this," he said quietly. "A home, a partner, someone to build a life with." Lira turned to face him, her eyes soft in the candlelight. "Neither did I. My clan expected me to mate within the tribe to someone safe and predictable. They were not pleased when I told them I had chosen a human, but they came around. They saw how you looked at me," she smiled. "And how I looked at you. That is hard to argue with." "I love you," Brennan said, because it needed to be said, because he would never tire of saying it. "I know." Lira kissed him, slow and deep. "I love you too." The years that followed were not easy, but they were good. The valley prospered under their stewardship, the farms thrived, and the wolves returned in cautious numbers, no longer hunted to the brink. Brennan and Lira became fixtures of the community, trusted and respected, and their cabin became a gathering place for anyone who needed help or advice or simply a friendly ear. 3 years into their marriage, Lira gave birth to a daughter. They named her Greta, and she had her mother's green skin and her father's brown eyes and a laugh that could light up a room. 2 years later came another girl, Zara, who was quieter and more thoughtful but no less loved. The cabin expanded to accommodate them. Rooms added on in stages, and the garden grew to include a play area where the girls could run and tumble without fear. Brennan taught them to track and shoot, to read the land and respect its rhythms. Lira taught them the stories of her people, the songs and the histories, the importance of clan and honor. Together they raised their daughters to be strong and kind, to stand up for what was right, and to judge people by their actions rather than their appearance. The valley changed around them, slowly but surely. More orcs came down from the high peaks, drawn by the safety and opportunity that Lira represented. More humans learned to see past old prejudices, to recognize that strength and honor came in many forms. It was not perfect. There were still fights, still misunderstandings, still people who clung to hate, but it was better. Measurably, undeniably better. On the 10th anniversary of their first meeting, Brennan and Lira returned to the clearing where he had shared his fire with a stranger. It looked the same. The ring of stones, the flat log, the canopy of oak leaves filtering the sunlight, but everything else had changed. "You ever wonder what would have happened if I had not stepped into the light that night?" Lira asked. She was leaning against him, her head on his shoulder, their fingers intertwined. "Every day," Brennan admitted. "But then I remember that you did step into the light, and I did not reach for my rifle, and everything that came after was a choice we made together." "Methodical choices," Lira teased. "Keeping us alive, keeping us together." He kissed the top of her head. "That is all I have ever wanted." They stayed until the sun began to set, talking about their daughters and their plans and the rumors of a wolf pack denning in the northern hills. Then they walked back to their cabin through the familiar woods, hand in hand, and Brennan thought that if he could go back and tell his younger self anything, it would be this: trust the stranger at your fire, because sometimes the best things in life come from the choices you make in a single moment of grace. Their cabin glowed warm in the twilight, smoke rising from the chimney, and through the windows they could see their daughters setting the table for supper. Greta was singing something in Orcish, her voice high and pure, and Zara was laughing at some private joke. It was ordinary and perfect, the kind of scene Brennan had never imagined he would be lucky enough to witness, let alone live. Lira squeezed his hand. "Come on," she said. "They are waiting for us." And so they went home. The seasons turned, as they always did, and the valley flourished under the stewardship of its wardens. Brennan and Lira grew older together, their hair silvering, their hands weathering, but their partnership remained as strong as it had been that first night by the fire. They faced droughts and hard winters, disputes and occasional violence, But they faced it together, and that made all the difference. When Greta was 15 and Zara 13, the girls began training formally as wardens themselves, learning the skills and responsibilities that would one day be theirs. Greta had her mother's instinct for tracking and her father's patience with people. Zara had a gift for negotiation and a fierce protective streak that reminded Brennan of Lira the night she had stepped into the firelight, wary but unafraid. "They will be good at this," Lira said one evening as they watched the girls practice their archery in the meadow behind the cabin. "Better than we were, I think. They have the advantage of our mistakes," Brennan pointed out, "and they are growing up in a world where humans and orcs work together. That is not nothing. It is everything." Lira leaned into him and he wrapped an arm around her waist. "We built this, Brennan. Not just the cabin or the gardens or even our family. We built a place where our daughters can be themselves without fear. That is worth more than all the coin in all the Lord's coffers." "It is," he agreed, "though I would not say no to a little more coin." "Zara wants new boots and Greta has her eye on a better bow." Lira laughed, the sound rich and familiar. "Then we will have to take on another contract. Perhaps there is a troublesome bear that needs tracking or a lost herd that needs finding. Perhaps." Brennan kissed her temple. "But tonight, I think we should just enjoy this." So they did. They stood together in the golden light of evening, watching their daughters laugh and compete and grow, and Brennan thought about the path that had led him here. A muddy track in the woods, a shared fire, a decision to trust instead of fear. It had seemed like such a small thing at the time, offering a stranger a portion of roasted rabbit and a seat by the flames. But it had changed everything. By dawn she had refused to leave his side. By summer they were partners. By autumn they were in love. And now, years later, they were still here, still together, building a life that was richer and stranger and more beautiful than anything he could have imagined. The fire crackled in the hearth as night fell fully, and the family gathered around the table for their evening meal. Greta told a rambling story about tracking a fox through the berry thickets, complete with dramatic gestures and sound effects. Zara interjected with corrections and commentary, which led to a good-natured argument that Lira settled with a raised eyebrow and a pointed look. Brennan served the stew he had made, thick with vegetables from their garden and venison from a deer he had taken the week before. It was ordinary. It was everything. After the meal, the girls cleaned the dishes while Brennan and Lira sat by the fire, her head resting on his shoulder, his arm around her waist. Outside, the night was alive with sound. Owls calling, wind rustling through the trees, the distant howl of wolves in the high country. Inside, there was warmth and light and the quiet contentment of a family at peace. "I have been thinking," Lira said after a long silence, "about what comes next. Next, when the girls are grown and taking on more of the warden duties, what we will do with our time." Brennan considered that. "I suppose we could retire. Let them handle the valley while we sit on the porch and complain about how things were better in our day." Lira snorted. "That sounds terrible." "It does," he admitted. "What did you have in mind? There are valleys beyond this one. Places where humans and orcs do not live in peace, where there is no one to stand up for justice or protect the vulnerable. I thought perhaps we could travel, offer our services as consultants or mediators, teach others what we have learned." Brennan turned the idea over, feeling a spark of interest. That could be good. Challenging, but good. It would mean leaving the cabin for months at a time. The cabin will still be here when we return, and the girls are more than capable of managing without us. He tightened his arm around her. "I like the idea of seeing more of the world, especially if I get to see it with you." Lira smiled, the expression soft and content. "Then we have a plan." "We have a plan," Brennan echoed. They sat in comfortable silence, watching the fire burn down to embers, and Brennan thought about the future stretching ahead of them. More years, more adventures, more moments like this one, quiet and warm and full of love. It was more than he had ever expected, more than he had ever dared to hope for, and he was grateful for every single day. When the fire finally died, they banked the coals and went to bed, climbing the ladder to the loft where their room overlooked the valley. Through the window, they could see the stars, bright and cold and eternal, and the dark shapes of the mountains rising in the distance. Somewhere out there, other hunters were making their camps, other lost travelers were seeking shelter, other lives were intersecting in ways that would change everything. But here, in this cabin, in this bed, there was only Brennan and Lira, husband and wife, partners in all things. She curled against him, her breath warm on his neck, and he held her close, marveling at how perfectly they fit together. "Thank you," he said quietly. "For what?" "For stepping into the firelight that night, for trusting me, for building this life with me." Lira kissed his jaw, his cheek, his mouth. "Thank you for not reaching for your rifle, for offering me your fire, for seeing me instead of a monster." "I never saw a monster," Brennan said. "Only a woman who was brave and capable and beautiful and who became the most important person in my world." "Flatterer," Lira teased, but her voice was thick with emotion. "Truth-teller," he corrected. They made love then, slow and tender, a reaffirmation of everything they had built together. Afterward, they lay entwined in the darkness, listening to the sounds of the night and the soft breathing of their daughters in the rooms below. Brennan felt a profound sense of peace, the kind that came from knowing exactly where you belonged and who you belonged with. "I love you," Lira whispered. "I love you too," Brennan replied. "Always." And as sleep claimed them, he thought once more about that first night, the fire, the rabbit, the green-skinned stranger who had refused to leave his side by dawn. It had been the beginning of everything, the moment when his life had truly started, and he would be grateful for it until his last breath. The morning came gentle and golden, light spilling through the window to wake them slowly. Brennan opened his eyes to find Lira already awake, watching him with an expression he knew well, love and contentment and a hint of mischief. "What?" he asked, smiling. "Just thinking about how lucky I am," she said. "How lucky we both are." "Very lucky," he agreed. Downstairs, the girls were already up, and the smell of frying eggs and fresh bread drifted up to the loft. Brennan and Lira dressed and descended the ladder to join them, and the day began as so many had before, with food and laughter and plans for the work ahead. But beneath the ordinary rhythms, there was an undercurrent of joy, a recognition that they had built something rare and precious. A family, a home, a partnership that had started with a shared fire and grown into a love that would endure for all their days. And as Brennan looked around the table at his wife and daughters, at the life they had created together, he knew that every choice he had made that led him to this moment had been worth it. Every risk, every hardship, every act of faith. He had shared his fire with a lost orc woman. By dawn, she had refused to leave his side. And in the years that followed, they had built a world where that was not just possible, but celebrated. Where love transcended the boundaries of species and culture, where justice mattered more than power, and where two people who should have been enemies became partners, lovers, and the foundation of something extraordinary. It was not the ending Brennan had expected when he set out to hunt a killer in a troubled valley. But it was the ending he had found, and he would not trade it for anything. The story of the hunter and the orc woman became legend in the valley, told and retold around fires and tables for generations. Some versions were embellished, adding dragons or magic or great battles. But the core remained true. A man who chose trust over fear, a woman who chose partnership over isolation, and the love that grew between them against all odds. And in the cabin on the high summer pasture, Brennan and Lira lived that legend every day, their lives a testament to the power of a single choice made in kindness and courage. By the time their daughters were grown and taking on the full responsibilities of the warden posts, Brennan and Lira were ready for their next adventure. They packed light, taking only what they needed for the road, and set out to share their knowledge with other valleys, other communities, other people struggling to bridge the gap between humans and orcs. They traveled for 5 years, teaching and learning, mediating disputes and training new wardens. They saw wonders and horrors, made friends and enemies, and everywhere they went they left things a little better than they found them. It was hard work, often thankless, but it mattered. And they did it together, as they had done everything since that first night by the fire, when they finally returned to their valley. Older and wearier but no less devoted to each other, they found their daughters thriving. Greta had married a farmer's son and was expecting her first child. Zara had taken a position as chief warden and was training a new generation of peacekeepers. The cabin had been expanded again, and there was a room waiting for Brennan and Lira, ready for whenever they chose to stay. "Welcome home," Greta said, embracing them both. "It is good to be back," Lira replied, her voice thick with emotion. That night, the family gathered once more around the table, now larger to accommodate new members and growing children. There was food and wine and laughter, and stories about the journeys Brennan and Lira had taken and the changes that had come to the valley in their absence. And later, when the house was quiet and everyone had gone to bed, Brennan and Lira climbed to the loft one more time. They stood at the window, looking out over the valley they had protected and nurtured for so many years, and Brennan wrapped his arms around his wife. "We did it," he said quietly. "We made a difference." "We did," Lira agreed. "And we are not done yet." "No," Brennan said, smiling. "We are not done yet. Because there was always more work to do, more love to share, more moments to treasure, and as long as they had each other, they would face it all with courage and grace. The hunter had shared his fire with a lost orc woman. By dawn, she had refused to leave his side. And together, they had built a life worth living, a love worth celebrating, and a legacy that would endure long after they were gone. It was enough. It was everything. And when Brennan closed his eyes that night, Lira warm and safe in his arms, he knew that he had found exactly what he had been searching for all his life, even though he had not known he was searching until the moment he found it: peace, love, home, and a partner who would stand beside him, now and always, in firelight and shadow, in joy and sorrow, until the end of their days.